The psychologist Carl Jung once diagnosed a spiritual sickness. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The real quote from his work Ion being, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. This warning has never been more relevant to our collective political life. It's a profound and unsettling feeling of being a passenger in your own history, watching events unfold on a screen as you become numb to the headlines of another war, another crisis, and another tragedy, all of which feel like a script written by unseen forces. This widespread feeling of disconnection is not an illusion, but a well-documented political reality, as public trust in government has collapsed to near historic lows. In the face of a system that feels fundamentally broken, a question echoes in every election cycle, a collective sigh of, why can't we just have a good politician? The desire for a leader with integrity is a natural response. But what if this search for a hero is the trap that allows all of these horrible events to occur? Whether we realize it or not, our impulse to look for one person or a group of people for praise or blame is a modern echo of the great man theory, an idea famously articulated by the 19th century historian who asserted that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. We are fed and eagerly consume highly romanticized, heroic views of leadership. When confronted with systemic problems that have no simple cause, we retreat into the simplistic fantasy of the leader. And in the absence of clear answers, the romanticized conception of leadership permits us to be more comfortable in associating leaders by ascribing them control and responsibility. Once we become psychologically invested in a romanticized view of leadership, we engage in selective perceptions and confirmatory biases, building an intellectual prison where we consciously avoid or resist information and evidence that diminishes the significance of leadership. Recently, there was a conversation I watched between Norman Finkelstein and Cornel West on the Holocaust and the concept of the marketplace of ideas that greatly influenced this video.
It's a radical statement though, but it's also in our jurisprudence. She said you have the right to advocate anti-Semitism and you have the right to advocate genocide. In many respects, that's sort of the end of the discussion. It means everything that the assault that's gone on against the universities is completely illegal under our constitutional system and as it's been interpreted.
The argument went back and forth many times, and the two other speakers were having a very difficult time understanding Finkelstein's greater point that a genocidal regime doesn't exist without those who rationalize for them. Let me dive deeper into this. In our history books, in our collective consciousness, we often focus on Hitler as one of the sole architects of the Holocaust, a great evil, and the creator of a horrible ideology. But in reality, Hitler's evil was not some alien force that descended upon an unsuspecting Germany. It was a poison welcomed and administered by the so-called respectable elites. These were the academics, the journalists, and the business owners, the gatekeepers of society who saw in his ideology the solution for the ills of society. They took his raw, undisguised sadism and repackaged it as a political necessity, translating his genocidal fantasies into a palatable language of national renewal, order, and safety by targeting minorities, immigrants, and foreign elements and ideologies. Hannah Arendt wrote that totalitarian rulers start their careers by boasting of their past crimes and carefully outlining their future ones. For a highly disillusioned and cynical public, she argued that the general population would believe even the most outlandish lies if it suited their cynicism. They do not need to deceive the public. They need only rely on the countless reasonable voices in media, business, and education. Ideas succeed because they are laundered through the institutions of a respectable society, presented in a form that would not alarm the comfortable. The masked man who Himmler organized for the greatest mass crimes ever committed in history bore the features of the Philistine, rather than of the mob man. And it was the bourgeois who, in the midst of the ruins of his world, worried about nothing so much as his private security. The perfect recruit for the greatest crimes in history was not the ideologue, but the ordinary man ready to sacrifice everything, belief, honor, and dignity, for the illusion of personal safety. The faith in the marketplace of ideas is a dangerous and historically illiterate fantasy. It treats abstract concepts like freedom as sacred principles that are completely detached from the material consequences of their application. This is a rigid deontological worldview that fetishizes the process of debate while remaining blind to its real-world outcomes, lacking the guardrails to prevent its own subversion. The naive belief that good ideas will simply win, and that people will naturally discern truth from falsehood, is a catastrophic misreading of how evil actually takes root. This entire framework is predicated on a self-serving slippery slope fallacy, that if we start silencing war criminals, who's to say it won't be me eventually? A paranoid delusion that willfully ignores the proven mechanics of totalitarian propaganda. Do we seriously believe the architects of genocide will openly declare that Jews should be murdered? That is not how a society is corrupted. Evil is laundered through euphemism and abstraction. And as Hannah Arendt documented, the Nazi regime operated under rigid language rules. Documents rarely used words like extermination or killing. Instead, they relied on a bureaucratic lexicon like final solution, evacuation, and special treatment. In a society ravaged by economic depression, cultural erosion, and social atomization, the average German was left desperate for connection. This collective despair created a vacuum, which was expertly filled by a powerful political narrative, one that promised national unity, celebrated cultural pride, and channeled all blame onto foreign elements within the country. While this rhetoric does not openly call for violence, its core assumptions and logical endpoints were fundamentally insidious, laying the moral and intellectual groundwork for the atrocities that would follow. The point of this language, Arendt notes, was not to hide the truth from the perpetrators, but to prevent them from equating it with their old, normal knowledge of murder and lies. By invoking God in a Christian nation, appealing to concepts like a people's community, and cloaking his genocidal ambitions in the language of divine will, fascist ideas enter this marketplace of ideas by poisoning the well. To seriously critique the marketplace of ideas and the great man theory, one must confront the complete moral inversion engineered during the Holocaust. We tell ourselves a simple story of SS officers and soldiers carrying out the evil, but the historical record reveals a far more insidious and efficient system. The Nazis' true organizational genius lay in outsourcing the mechanics of genocide to the victims themselves. Across occupied Europe, from Amsterdam to Warsaw, they empowered Jewish councils with, in the chilling language of the bureaucracy, absolute disposal over all Jewish wealth and manpower. They compiled the lists of persons and property, secured funds from deportees to pay for their own extermination, and supplied the police forces to herd their own people onto trains. This process became so grotesquely normalized that even the sale of Yellow Star armbands in Warsaw became a regular business among the Jews. This complicity is not a footnote. It is the central, horrifying engine of the final solution. The fact that without Jewish administrative and police assistance, the fact that the final roundup in Berlin was conducted entirely by Jewish police, the Nazi regime would have faced complete chaos or an impossibly severe drain on German manpower. The system functioned by making victims accomplices in their own destruction, creating a moral catastrophe that simplistic theories of good versus evil cannot begin to explain. The German people were not passive victims of this either. As historian Ian Kershaw documents, the Führer cult was a grassroots phenomenon, a craving for a man of destiny that his followers projected onto him long before he ceased to state. Already in spring 1933, the personality cult surrounding Hitler was burgeoning and developing extraordinary manifestations. The levels of hero worship had never been witnessed before in Germany. Hitler's 44th birthday on April 20th, 1933, saw an extraordinary outpouring of adulation as the entire country glutted itself with festivities in honor of the leader of the new Germany. On the 19th of August, the silent coup of the first days of the month duly gained its ritual plebiscitary confirmation. According to the official figures, 89.9% of the voters supported Hitler's constitutionally now unlimited powers as head of state, head of government, leader of the party, and supreme commander of the armed forces. The biography shows that supporters shared and amplified his hatred of Jews. His anti-Semitic rhetoric was consistently the most popular part of his message. The most convenient lie we tell ourselves about the Third Reich is that the German people were brainwashed. The truth is far more damning. Not only were they not passive incomes of propaganda, they were its eager consumers. They actively wanted to believe the lies and sought out any justification to prove them true. The problem with a man like Eichmann was not his monstrosity, but that so many people were just like him, neither perverted nor sadistic, but terribly and terrifyingly normal. This was not a failure of intellect or a failure of conscience. It was, as Arendt wrote, a sheer thoughtlessness, a willful refusal to think that turned ordinary citizens into the greatest criminals in modern history. So let us finally dispense with the comfortable myth that one man alone was responsible. The historical record is a damning indictment of an entire nation. When the Nazis invaded Poland, for example, historian Richard Evans notes that an American journalist had still to find a German who sees anything wrong in the German destruction of Poland. We also hear this narrative that the German people had no knowledge of a genocidal plan. But as the historian Richard Evans states, the mass murder of the Jews became a kind of open secret in Germany from the end of 1942 at the very latest. The claim that they had known nothing was a desperate, self-serving fiction. They knew. They simply chose to be spectators. And in that state of political spectatorship, a society becomes vulnerable to the most dangerous illusion of non-complicity. The Nazis are one of the many proofs that a marketplace can be captured and corrupted from within. To have a serious critique of fascism is to admit that its rise was facilitated by the very liberal systems that were supposed to prevent it. Totalitarian movements, as Arendt warned, do not simply oppose democracy. They hollow it out from the inside. They use their own language of freedom to undermine it, entering its institutions only to expose them as fraudulent. Their propaganda is not a set of arguments, but a new reality. A lying world of consistency designed to shut the masses off from the real world in its endless shocks. The rhetoric of the silent majority is a foundational grift of fascism. It is the insidious machinery that grinds down societal cohesion into a powder keg of resentment ready to be ignited. It operates on a simple, venomous formula. First, create an imaginary monolith of the virtuous, the real people, who are besieged and ignored. Then fabricate the enemy within. The elites are against you. You are better than them. This manufactures a sense of inherent unearned superiority. And finally, something foreign is poisoning our country. This dehumanizes the designated scapegoat, whether it be the minority, the immigrant, or the dissident, transforming them from human beings into a contagion that must be eradicated for the health of the body politic. Therefore, fascists did not hate the freedoms of the Weimar Republic. They loved democracy, the media, and free speech, because they knew that these were the perfect tools to gain power. Once that power was secured, the tools, having served their purpose, were the first things to be destroyed. But elites masking their interests to be the same as the common people is nothing new. It's something the philosopher Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony. This is the process where the values of the ruling class become the common sense of a society, creating a unifying myth that papers over deep contradictions. It encourages ordinary people to identify their interests with those of the elite. Let's use the myth we are told about the great men of the West. They were not selfish patriots, but an elite class deeply unsatisfied with the British Empire. As historian E.S. Morgan makes clear, the very concept of English freedom that they revered was tied to land ownership, as well as the ability to own slaves. Regarding the American Revolution, Morgan states it plainly. The freedom of the free depended more than we like to admit on the enslavement of more than 20% of us. The freedom that they cherished was not merely adjacent to slavery, it was purchased with slavery. Their liberty, their freedom, was the liberty and freedom to own property and other human beings. To To call the founders hypocrites is to engage in a dangerous form of historical sanitization. It suggests a universal promise was broken, when in fact no promise was ever made. As Frederick Douglass's unsparing portrait of Lincoln demonstrates, the founders operated with chilling clarity, that they were white men building a white republic, that their exclusion of black people was not an accident, but the central organizing principle of their new world. That America was not a nation founded on freedom that had stumbled into racism, but that it was founded on racism and has been forced, century by century, to concede slivers of freedom. Although Douglass's critique was not focused on Lincoln, we will use our method of critiquing the great man fallacy to engage with the narrative of Lincoln as the great emancipator. This comforting narrative, however, obscures a more complex truth, as his primary and explicitly stated goal was never abolition, but the preservation of the Union. And what was that Union? A state of genocide, ethnic cleansing, slavery, and imperialism. As he famously wrote in his letter to Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." Imagine the chief of medicine at a world-renowned hospital, in the midst of a catastrophic pandemic, declaring, "My paramount object in the struggle is to save the hospital's reputation. If I could save our reputation without saving any patients, I would do it. And if I could save it by ensuring every patient dies, I would do it." We would never accept that logic. Therefore, in understanding Abraham Lincoln, it's crucial to set aside the myth of the great emancipator and examine his stated priorities at the outset of the Civil War. As the historian Richard H. details, Lincoln's paramount objective was never abolition, but the preservation of the Union, a cause to which everything was subordinate. This wasn't merely a passive position. In his inaugural address, Lincoln didn't just promise not to interfere with slavery. He actively endorsed a constitutional amendment that would have protected the institution in perpetuity. He went so far as to say he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So given his willingness to permanently embed slavery into the Constitution, the pivotal question isn't if his objective changed, but why. The historical record is clear. The shift was not born of a subtle moral epiphany. The true catalyst for emancipation came from the enslaved themselves, in a mass movement that W.E.B. Du Bois famously termed a general strike. In his masterwork, Black Reconstruction in America, he paints a stunning picture of this exodus. An army of slaves and fugitives, by the hundreds of thousands, rising up and leaving its ancient bondage, and pushing irresistibly towards Union lines. Du Bois argued that the enslaved black worker, who produced the South's food and raw materials, held the ultimate key to the war. As Du Bois puts it, this slow, stubborn mutiny presented a simple choice. Either these 4 million laborers remained quietly at work, or the fighters starved. The spirit of rebellion was a constant simmering threat on the mainland. While there were countless uprisings, the most spectacular was the 1811 German Coast Uprising in Louisiana, an event historian Daniel Rasmussen calls the largest act of armed resistance against slavery in the history of the United States. But that revolt was merely the largest explosion on what Rasmussen powerfully describes as a powder keg ready to be ignited. The entire slave system rested on this volatility, as enslaved people waged a daily war to demolish slaveholders' authority, through acts of sabotage, like aborting their own children, poisoning livestock, lighting fires, and escaping to the cypress swamps. But even the 1811 uprising pales in comparison to the Haitian Revolution, an event that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic and reshaped the struggle for abolition. In his seminal work, The Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James explains that this was the ultimate realization of the planters' worst nightmares. For the first time, slave owners everywhere saw a population of enslaved people become armed and able to topple planters and colonial governments alike. James frames this as one of the great epics of revolutionary struggle precisely because it remains the only successful slave revolt in history. He chronicles the profound transformation of slaves, trembling, before a single white man into a people able to organize themselves and defeat the most powerful European nations. Crucially, James rejects any great man theory of history, and he states it plainly. Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. This spirit of collective self-liberation was best captured by the revolutionaries themselves, who declared their freedom was no longer in France's hands. It is in our own. We will defend it or perish. To reduce the history of slave resistance to a hagiography of its famous leaders is not just a mistake, but a betrayal of the movement itself. While we rightly honor figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, casting them as saviors imposes a great man theory that they would have vehemently rejected. Their purpose was never to be worshipped, but to act as catalysts, to ignite the conviction that liberation was a collective task, held in the hands of the enslaved themselves. The call to action was not to follow a singular leader, but to turn to your neighbor, the person in the next row, the family in the adjacent cabin, and forge a common path to freedom. This was a movement built on the unshakable foundation of horizontal solidarity, not vertical leadership. And it was powered by a radical rejection of the idea that freedom could ever be granted. It had to be seized. It's a profound act of intellectual laziness to reduce history to a simplistic morality play of heroes and villains. We endlessly condemn historical figures, from Confederate generals to the American founders, assigning blame as if their personal virtues or vices were the primary engines of history. Do we seriously believe that if these specific men had never been born, the machinery of slavery and colonial expansion would have never existed? To believe so is profoundly naive. The most searing lesson of the 20th century, burned into our consciousness by the Holocaust, is that leaders do not cause a society's sickness. They are merely its most visible symptom. Following Eric Williams' trenchant analysis in Capitalism and Slavery, we must reject the comforting lie that humanitarianism alone destroyed the slave system. Williams argued that to believe this fable is to sacrifice scholarship to sentimentality and commit a grave historical error. While he acknowledged the humanitarians as the spearhead of the onslaught, he insisted their role had been grossly exaggerated as part of what he called one of the greatest propaganda movements of all time. This perspective is not just historically shallow. It is a calculated insult to the actual architects of freedom, erasing a history written in blood and fire, and ignoring the generations of black resistance that made emancipation an unavoidable political and military necessity. This hero worship is not unique to mainstream politics. Revolutionary leftist movements have their own version, creating the archetype of the revolutionary genius in figures like Lenin and Mao. This veneration is rooted in a theory known as vanguardism, famously articulated in Lenin's pamphlet, What is to be Done. Lenin argued that the working class, left to its own devices, could only develop a limited trade union consciousness, the struggle for better wages and conditions within the existing system. True revolutionary awareness, which he called socialist consciousness, was not something that arose spontaneously from within the class. Instead, Lenin insisted it must be brought to the workers from without. This is a designated role of the vanguard, a disciplined party of professional revolutionaries tasked with injecting correct revolutionary theory into the broader mass movement. This vanguardist model, where a group of elites guides a supposedly impassive mass, was famously challenged from within the Marxist tradition by Rosa Luxemburg. She passionately argued for the spontaneity of the masses, rejecting the notion that revolutionary consciousness could only be injected from the outside. For Luxemburg, real revolutions were not the work of a party committee under an all-powerful and brilliant leader. She believed it was only the broad masses shedding their blood who truly counted. In any revolution, she argued, it is the masses themselves who find the means of struggle best suited to the given conditions. She argued that a revolutionary party's role was not to command the people from on high, but to clarify and coordinate the immense creative energy they already possessed. This critique extends beyond political leaders. obstacles to the very worship of foundational thinkers. An analyst like Karl Marx is transformed from the originator of a critical method into an infallible prophet, and his work is ossified from a dynamic theory into a static dogma. This process reduces a vast intellectual toolkit to a simple catechism, used to justify the authority of a party or a state. Such dogmatism is a profound betrayal of the original work, which was never intended as a collection of sacred, timeless truths. Ironically, Karl Marx himself was one of the fiercest critics of this kind of dogmatism. In an 1877 letter, he took aim at a writer who had twisted his historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a universal formula, what Marx called a historico-philosophic theory of the general path imposed by fate upon every people. Marx flatly rejected this attempt to turn his analysis into a prophecy, sarcastically writing, "But I beg his pardon. He is both honoring and shaming me too much." By ignoring Marx's own warning, many movements do exactly what he feared. They elevate thinkers to the status of prophets. Whether it's a president, a king, or a revolutionary vanguard, the message is always the same. You are not the agent of your own liberation. Someone else knows better than you. Whether this analysis of the great man fallacy strikes you as obvious or not is beside the point, because its most common and insidious manifestation is the reflexive, cynical retort of, "What can I do about it anyway?" It's a phrase I've heard time and time again, and we must be brutally honest about what this phrase truly represents. It is not an admission of helplessness, but a moral alibi. It's a powerful psychological shield we raise to ourselves when we witness immense suffering in order to preserve our fragile self-image as good people. It's a mantra that absolves us of responsibility, because by declaring ourselves powerless, we permit ourselves to do nothing. This critique is not meant to saddle any single individual with the guilt of the world's atrocities. That would be absurd. It is equally absurd, however, to expect a single individual to possess the power to fix them unilaterally. These two ideas, paralyzing guilt and messianic ambition, are two sides of the same debilitating coin. Both are symptoms of the great man theory. So you acknowledge an injustice, but claim you're in no position to act. Fine. The relevant question then is not what you can do today, but what are you actively doing to be in a position to act tomorrow? How, specifically, are you investing your time, your money, your connections, and your resources to build a collective capable of forcing change? Here the answer for many will be nothing. Therefore, for the vast majority, the lament, "I can't do anything," is a lie. It is not a declaration of innocence or a cry of empathetic frustration. It is a calculated signal designed to shield profound indifference. It is the alibi for apathy, where inaction reveals a truth that words attempt to hide, that you do not actually care. The first act of liberation is therefore an act of intellectual violence against oneself. It is to shatter the shield of self-congratulation and admit the ugly truth that we are not as good as we think we are. And the second admission must follow immediately from the first. We must affirm that, as a collective, we are not nearly as powerless as we have been pretending to be. The historical record, as Eric Foner observes, reveals that the very concept of freedom as a universal birthright was not the creation of great men or the founding fathers. It was forged in the fires of struggle by those they excluded. Time and time again, our history shows that the definition of rights has been transformed not by the powerful, but by the demands of those locked outside the gates. It was the abolitionists who had to invent the radical and truly American idea that freedom should not be bound by blood or birth. Therefore, do not be deceived by the histories written by the powerful, as nearly every major advance in social justice was won not by a politician's benevolent decree, but by the relentless, organized struggle of ordinary people. the 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, and the dismantling of Jim Crow were not gifts bestowed from on high. They were concessions ripped from the hands of a reluctant system by mass movements that made the status quo untenable. Great men did not lead these changes. They were forced to react to them. They are, as Tolstoy wrote in War and Peace, merely slaves of history, deluded figures who believe they are commanding a tide that is in reality sweeping them along. Therefore, the antidote to the great man fallacy is not just to organize, but to practice prefigurative politics, to live one's political ideals in the present, to search for a new agency of change and revolution, and to build a new world in the shell of the old. It is the recognition that our liberation lies in our hands, not your hands or my hands, but our hands through practices like mutual aid, where we take collective responsibility for each other's well-being, and community assemblies, where we practice direct democracy. This is not about waiting for a hero to save us. It's about making heroes irrelevant by saving ourselves. No one articulated this better than the American socialist Eugene V. Debs in his life writings and speeches. I do not want you to follow me or anyone else. If you are looking for Moses to lead you out of this capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I would not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I led you in, someone else would lead you out.